Welcome to another episode of Fast to Heal Stories. This one is going to be a jam-packed with great information about how you can tell the severity of your insulin resistance. And unfortunately, this isn't real cut and dried. It's not like black or white, like, yes, you have insulin resistance to this level. No, you don't have any. Insulin resistance runs on a spectrum, as I have talked about in many previous episodes, but I wanted to get you the most up-to-date information because I know a lot of people don't have any idea what insulin resistance is, whether or not they have it. And if you suspect you do have insulin resistance, this episode will help you figure out, with both symptoms and labs that you can get drawn, to help you see where the severity of your insulin resistance lies and how you can start to know the improvements that you're seeing, how you can measure the improvements both physically and with lab work, and make sure that you're moving in the right direction and making progress as far as reversing your insulin resistance. So I'm an insulin resistance expert. That's what I live and breathe pretty much all day, every day. When I am working, I help people reverse it, because if you do have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, you have NAFLD, which is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is very prominent, and it is exploding. And it is because people are just taking in too much sugar, too much ultra processed food. That's the non-alcoholic form of fatty liver. Hard to diagnose because you don't have a lot of symptoms a lot of times with fatty liver. Or if you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, that is almost always driven by insulin resistance in the ovary. So all of these diseases, high blood pressure is almost always due to insulin resistance as well. If you have any of these disease states or multiple of these disease states, you definitely have some insulin resistance. But I am so excited about today because Low Insulin Academy is finally open. The doors open at 8 a.m. Central Time on Tuesday, September 5th. So if you are listening to this as it comes out, you're probably one of the very first people to realize that the doors are open. I mean, I have sent out emails, and I hope that if you wanted to join Low Insulin Academy, that you got yourself on my wait list, because you'll get a special email with a discount. And I've been announcing that for months and months. So hopefully those who really wanted to get in were on the wait list. You got an email with the discount code. You can go ahead and sign up. Please know I am only offering the live enrollment period up until September 14th. So you have 10 days to get yourself enrolled in Low Insulin Academy. So if you know that you want to get enrolled, go ahead and do it now before you forget, because I'm one of those people, I'm like, I'll see the first email that comes out. It says, oh, doors are open, get yourself in. I'm like, oh yeah, I have a week to do that. And then the week passes and I totally forget about it. And then I'm kicking myself. So don't be one of those people. Get yourself in there if you know that this is the time. This is like, you have insulin resistance. You have a disease that is caused by insulin resistance. Get your butt inside Low Insulin Academy and learn what you need to learn in order to reverse it. These diseases are lifestyle diseases that can be improved and reversed and kept into remission with proper lifestyle. It is really that simple. I'm not saying it's simple to reverse these things. You do have to put some work in. It takes time and patience, but it's once you understand their lifestyle diseases and you just reverse them in the opposite way of how you got ill, you just know. But very, very exciting that the doors are open. But let's first talk about, so today we're going to talk about, how do you know the severity of your insulin resistance? Sorry, my mind is just kind of frazzled today because I'm so excited that doors are open. I should say there's a link in the show notes if you want to get yourself enrolled in Low Insulin Academy, or you can go to fasttoheal.info/LIA live. Okay. I think it's LIA live. Double check the show note link if that's not working for you. I should know this all off the top of my head. There's so many links running through my brain right now. If it's not LIA Live, it's Low Insulin Academy Live. And now that I think about it, I really think it is www.fasttoheal.info/Low Insulin Academy Live. You go to my website, fasttoheal.info, you'll get yourself in the door, but don't miss the enrollment if that's something that you want help with reversing. And I'll go through a little bit more about the Academy after we go through the how to know about the severity of your insulin resistance. So let's talk about a little bit about metabolic health. Like, what does that even mean? How do you know you're metabolically healthy? And you probably heard, if you follow a lot of metabolic health professionals like myself, or like I like to say, like me, you've followed blood sugar specialists or natural health professionals. You've probably heard the statistic that only 7% of American adults are considered metabolically healthy on all fronts. So 93% of American adults have some sort of metabolic dysfunction. Well, what does that even mean? It's like we throw that percentage around, and hardly anybody knows what it means to be metabolically healthy. So bottom line is, to be metabolically healthy, it means that you're very efficiently utilizing the energy that you put in your body very efficiently. Your cells are metabolically sensitive, right? You eat something and your cells are able to utilize that energy. They're not sluggish. There's no hormonal imbalances. Your body is metabolizing food the way that it is intended to do so. But there are many what's the word I am looking for? Measurements. My goodness, seriously, guys, my brain's frazzled, so bear with me. There are many measurements that we can look at that we consider. If you are healthy with all of these measurements, then you are considered metabolically healthy. And that is how, in the studies that are done on metabolically health, that's how these percentages are come up with. Like, okay, this is how we know that 93% are metabolically not healthy, because they're failing in one of these measurement areas. So to be metabolically healthy, it means that you have to be at a healthy body weight, healthy BMI. We know that BMI is not perfect, right? Like, you can have a lot of muscle mass and be on the upper end, or be overweight on the BMI, but that is one of the measurements is BMI, and to be at a healthy weight. Another one would be a waist circumference. So this is how you can tell, even if you are a female or male who has a ton of muscle mass, you can look at your waist circumference, and like the BMI is not a great measurement for you. Women should have a waist circumference less than 30 and males less than 35. If you have higher waist circumference than that means you're likely storing some adipose tissue around the organs, around the waist. We don't want that, right? That's the most unhealthy type of fat, is to store around the organ area. So waist circumference is another one. Blood pressure, healthy blood pressure. So under 120/80, I like to see it actually under 110/70, but healthy blood pressure. We also have to have all of our cholesterol levels within the healthy range, in particular, triglycerides within a healthy range. Conventional medicine says less than 150. I like to see those less than 100, and optimally even less than 80 or 90. So that all has to be within a healthy range at all. So that's kind of what we look at with metabolic health. Oh, and healthy blood sugar, obviously. So a fasting blood sugar less than 100. So a healthy cholesterol panel, healthy blood sugars, healthy waist circumference, healthy blood pressure, healthy cholesterol panel. I think I said that. But all of those things, if you meet all of that criteria, you are considered metabolically healthy. So only 7% of Americans are fitting in that range, where they're meeting all of the criteria. So that's what how metabolic health is basically determined when we look at studies and that sort of thing. But I want to talk about how we know what our insulin resistance is, because if listening to the metabolic, all of the measurements that are looked at and the criteria, fasting insulin isn't one of them. So fasting insulin is one of those things that's gaining more attention because it should. Like, you really need to know what your fasting insulin is. And it's a huge marker for insulin resistance, but hardly anybody in conventional medicine is doing it. You have to basically go to a functional specialist or an integrative doctor to get your fasting insulin checked, or a provider such as me, where I specialize in this sort of thing. So, but when we're looking at insulin resistance and metabolic health totally interplay with each other. So there's definitely some overlap, but we can't automatically say that if you're metabolically unhealthy by the criteria set up, what I just went over, that you're automatically insulin resistant. There is some discrepancy here, like with percentages. You listen to certain people, you look at certain studies. Some say 80%, 80 to 90% of American adults have some sort of insulin resistance. Some will say 40 to 60. I think it's high. I think we can all agree it's way higher than where it should be. There's a lot more insulin resistance in American adults and just, westernized culture than there should be, for sure. So what are the physical symptoms of insulin resistance? I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I will review it. So somebody who can't go more than a couple of hours without eating, sometimes this is due to having hypoglycemic episodes, but almost always, if you're having reactive hypoglycemic episodes, you have some sort of insulin resistance because your body's just not utilizing blood sugars well, right? You're bottoming out, you're having highs, you're having lows. So the physical symptoms would be not being able to go more than a couple hours without eating, having to eat immediately upon waking, not, being able to, again, go, there's no metabolic flexibility there. You're not burning fat well, you're having to have carbohydrates in order to have energy. You have weight loss resistance. You're having a very hard time losing weight. Your blood sugars are a mess. You have any of the conditions that I talked about at the start of the podcast. Those are all, you have some sort of form of insulin resistance. You have, after you eat, you get really tired, especially in the afternoon. You have that, you eat lunch and you just want to go take a nap. That's a very telltale sign of insulin resistance. Like I said, blood sugars being wonky, not in the optimal range. What else? Weight loss resistance is a huge one. So not being able to lose weight no matter what you do, you're severely calorically restricted. You've been dieting for years, you've done all the things, and you still can't lose weight. A lot of times that's due to insulin resistance. So those are some of the telltale signs, symptoms that you might see. Skin issues would be another telltale sign, like skin tags. That's an indication of pretty severe insulin resistance in a lot of cases. A lot of times if you have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, you're dealing with skin tags. Those are the little skin tags that kind of jut out from your body. Browning around the neck or the elbows, the knees, that's another, if your skin's darker around those areas, that's another telltale sign of not only insulin resistance, but prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So those are some physical symptoms. So even without getting any kind of lab markers, and then some advanced symptoms of insulin resistance, where you're probably in type 2 diabetes phase, are having to urinate constantly, being really thirsty. Those are, your body's just trying to flush out extra glucose. So by that time you have severe insulin resistance, your blood sugars are really off. So those are some of the physical symptoms. Let's talk about the lab. And I throw those physical symptoms out, like, oh, just kind of rattling off a list, but they are very, very life altering in a lot of circumstances. Not being able to go a couple hours without eating, having to have snacks all the time. That's not how humans are supposed to be. You're supposed to be able to have energy, that doesn't plummet or, get tired throughout the day. That's not how we're supposed to operate. So don't just chalk it up to, I'm getting older. I just don't have the energy that I used to have. Like, those are blood sugar issues. Those are insulin or hormone issues. So they are very, very life altering. So let's talk about the lab work that you can look at as far as knowing the severity of your insulin resistance. So we can look at, kind of blood sugar lab work. We can look at cholesterol panels, but I'm going to talk about both of those because I know in the past I've talked about the HOMA IR being kind of the gold standard. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But there are limitations to that lab testing as well. It's very helpful to know, and it's kind of the best that we have at this point. But it's just kind of more of a snapshot. So I always talk about getting a fasting insulin, a fasting glucose, and a hemoglobin A1C. Those are kind of more of the blood sugar and the fasting insulin. Those tests you definitely want to ask for. And again, you might get some pushback with that fasting insulin. Conventional medicine just does not want to measure that for whatever reason. It's not in the standard of care to look at a fasting insulin. So you probably will have to keep pressing your endocrinologist, family practitioner, whatever. And if you can't, there's lots of labs around who will send you a home kit. I work with one inside my courses called ZRT labs. There are many that will do home kits, or you can find yourself a functional doctor or an integrative doctor to help run these tests. But blood sugar, it's a snapshot. So that's why I wanted to do this podcast, because a lot of these labs can be somewhat limiting because they're just giving you a snapshot of whatever is going on at that moment in time. So blood sugar, you want fasting less than 100 by conventional standards. I like to see it less than 90 in a fasted state. But the thing is with even blood sugar is if you get just one measurement, maybe you had a really poor night's sleep and it's bumped up from baseline from where you're usually at, or you had a really stressful morning or stressful couple of days and it's bumped up. So it is helpful to look at, but it's just a snapshot. So less than 100 by conventional standards. Like I said, I like to see it less than 90 in the morning. And then the hemoglobin A1C, again, there are limitations to all of these labs. That's why I like to make you well aware of the physical symptoms and then the lab work too. So you can kind of see collectively how you're turning your insulin resistance around. But the hemoglobin A1C is an average of your blood sugars over the last 3 months or so. So it's basically how much sugar is stuck to red blood cells in a percentage. And so the more blood sugar that you have in the system, the more sugary or, more that's going to get stuck to the red blood cells. So that's basically how it's measured, but it is an average. So it's helpful to look at. So we have like the blood sugar, the glucose is a snapshot of just what your blood sugar is then. And then the hemoglobin and A1C is an average of the last 3 months. The limitation that I see with hemoglobin A1C is that sometimes people are really struggling with hypoglycemia and they're getting really bad lows. They're kind of bottoming out and they're having symptoms of, shakiness, tiredness, sweating, having to eat right there, carb cravings. That's another sign of insulin resistance too, severe carb cravings and sugar cravings I didn't mention before, but then they're getting highs also. So their highs and lows are kind of balancing themselves out. So those with reactive hypoglycemia hypoglycemia or just even if it's not reactive, that can, be kind of a limitation of the hemoglobin A1C, because the average is going to show that, you're normal, but you're having some pretty severe highs and lows. And then, of course, the fasting insulin. And not many people have ever had this check. This is how I figured out I had insulin resistance. I mean, I had some physical signs, but I just thought that was normal. I thought it was normal to have to eat every couple of hours. I thought it was normal to crave carbohydrates. I thought it was normal to be bloated all the time. And once I reversed my insulin resistance, I was like, I don't have to think about food all the time. I don't have to eat every couple of hours. I don't have to eat the moment I wake up in the morning. But fasting insulin should be between 2 and 6. And if you're not in the United States, you may need to do some conversions with this, because I know outside the United States, the measurements are a little bit different. I don't know them off the top of my head, so you just have to look, do a search and convert it. But between 2 and 6 is optimal for fasting insulin. 6 to 12 is kind of beginning insulin resistance, where, at that 6 to 12 range, it's a little bit easier to turn things around. Says it's not as long standing, it's not as severe. And then over 12 is considered more severe, long standing insulin resistance. And it gets really confusing because in conventional medicine, usually up to 25 is considered normal, which is crazy. That's way too high. So you might get your test back if your conventional doctor does agree to do a fasting insulin and it comes back at 20, he or she might say, oh, you're in the normal range, where, whoa, that's dramatic, more severe insulin resistance. They're just not trained to know where the ranges are, how to reverse it, how to spot it. So over 12 is more severe. Now let's go to that HOMA IR score, because this is what I used to teach, where, this is the gold standard. And again, it is very helpful to look at. But it does have some limitations, because like I said, when you get a glucose reading done, it's just a snapshot, right? So I know I wore a CGM this summer for a few weeks, and I'm going to be wearing one again coming up here in the next week or so. But my baseline blood sugars were higher than normal, and it's taken me some time. I've just had a lot of stressors this summer, and some other things happen where I was trying to figure out why my baseline was higher. But anyway, if you had a really, like I said, a couple stressful days, or you didn't sleep well, you had really poor sleep, maybe you go to the lab and your glucose that morning is 105. And normally it's 85. Because we know that when you're really stressed or you're sleep deprived, you release more cortisol, and that increase in cortisol bumps up your blood sugars to where, even your baseline blood sugars. So it's looking like they're higher than normal. And I think that's what was happening with me. If you've listened to the podcast regularly, there's just been a lot going on, and I've had a lot of stress this summer. But anyway, the baseline can be bumped up. And then same with the insulin. So I've had people go in fasted to do their fasting insulin, and they've been fasting for 2 or 3 days. That's not going to give you a real true indication of where your fasting insulin is when you're eating. And of course, those longer fasts are going to help reverse insulin resistance, but I wouldn't recommend fasting more than like 14 hours when you're going in to get these tests done, just because they're not going to be real reflective of what's normal for your body. Okay. So if you're in a 2 or 3 day fast, that's a little abnormal from what you're normally doing. So you don't want to do that. So the HOMA IR score is basically taking your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose, multiplying those two numbers together and dividing by 405. was come up with, I can't remember who came up with the HOMA IR score range, but it's the best that we have right now to kind of measure insulin resistance, where you're taking the fasting insulin and the fasting glucose, combining them, and coming up with a range. So if you know your fasting insulin and you know your fasting glucose, multiply those together, divide by 405. Ideally, that number should be less than 1.6. Now, a range of like one, and again, there's some discrepancy depending on who you ask. Like 1.6 to 2 is kind of like beginning insulin resistance, and 2 to 2.6 is more severe, or over 2.6 is more severe. So it's just a way to kind of measure where you're at. But you need both the fasting glucose and the fasting insulin. And again, that fasting glucose is highly variable depending on what you've eaten, stress, what exercise, all kinds of things. That's another thing. You could do a really hard workout right before you go get your blood test done, and now you're dumping glucose into the bloodstream for energy, which is completely normal after a hard glucose, but it's not really reflective of what your baseline typically is. So that's why, in my course, I really encourage people to wear continuous glucose monitors, just because you get a really good understanding of what's actually happening with your blood sugar. So definitely you want to get those lab markers and measure them every 3 to 6 months, see where, what kind of progress you're making. The other lab markers I would encourage you to get would be an HSCRP, which is high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Now, this kind of gives you an indication of inflammation in your body, like people who have autoimmune issues or infections or, long-standing health issues. This is going to be elevated. I like to see it under 1 is basically very little inflammation in the body. Just to give you an idea, when my son was very ill with ulcerative colitis, his HSCRP would be between like 12 and 16 when he was really sick and in flares, which is really high. So like I said, you want that less than 1. It's not going to tell you exactly where your inflammation is, but it will tell you there's a lot going on inside your body as far as inflammation goes, and the body's just like stressed out, and we need to figure out, how to get that back in a healthier range. So it does give you an idea of like when his HSCRP was so high, he was only like 12, 13, 14 years old is when he was really struggling. So it's not really age indicative. It's not really, his disease state was happening in his colon, doesn't really tell you where, it just will tell you it's really high. So those people with severe insulin resistance, especially long-standing type 2 diabetes or fatty liver, this tends to be, any long-standing disease state, this tends to be high because your body's just been inflamed for a really long time. So that's another one, a useful lab to look for and to track. And the last would be a cholesterol panel. And there's a lot that goes into a cholesterol panel. It's like the standard of care is basically just getting, a total cholesterol, the HDL, the LDL, triglycerides, VLDL, which is very low density lipoprotein. Usually, those are pretty standard. So most people know where they're at. And again, the numbers don't always reflect metabolic health. You could have a cholesterol of 230 and be perfectly healthy, because most conventional medical physicians, providers, don't look at the particle size or the ApoB. So those are some additional measurements that are really helpful to look at. So what is ApoB? That's basically, it shuttles around like VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, and some other lipoproteins, where elevated levels of ApoB tend to be indicative of heart disease, because that's they're basically transporting plaques around, and you just have more plaque when you have elevated levels of ApoB. So it's APO and then capital B. And the other thing to look at that's really important is the particle size, and hardly anybody talks about this in conventional medicine. So you could have a cholesterol of 250, your HDL is really high, and your particle size. So we have large fluffy particle size or small dense particle size. And the large fluffy have very little pull on heart disease. It's the small dense particle size, the small dense lipoproteins that are problematic, because those are the ones that get stuck and can cause plaque. So I know LabCorp does this testing. It's harder to find. You can ask your provider about it, but chances are they're not going to know about it. They're not going to know how to measure it, but you can ask. It's worth an ask. Otherwise, LabCorp does do this. There's some other providers out there too, but that's one of them. So you want more of the large fluffy cholesterol that's not going to get stuck, and less of the small dense. So that's something to look for too. It's very, very important, rather than just saying, oh, my cholesterol is 240, I have to go on some statin. No, we want to look at the particle size, we want to look at the breakdown, and then if you can get your ApoB measured, that's very, very much more indicative of whether or not you will develop heart disease or not, and insulin resistances too. But another thing that you can look at, if you have a cholesterol panel, and pretty much everybody does, right, is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. That will also give you some indication of where you are at with insulin resistance, because if your triglycerides are elevated, you're almost always eating too much processed food, too much sugar. You're not eating well, because triglycerides are fats in the bloodstream. So you say, well, why would eating too much sugar, too much carbohydrate, too much ultra processed food reflect high triglycerides? A lot of people just think, oh, I got to cut back on fat because my triglycerides are elevated. Like, no, when we eat too many carbohydrates, too much food in general, and too much ultra processed foods full of sugar and terrible oils and just carbohydrate, your body can only store so much carbohydrate. And once it reaches that max storage, it's going to convert everything to fat. So you can't convert sugar to protein. You can convert sugar to fat. So if you're drinking a ton, liquid sugar is the absolute worst. You're drinking a lot of soda, even juice, a lot of sugary drinks, milkshakes, whatever it is, your body cannot handle all of that sugar. It's going to convert it to fat, and then your triglycerides start to climb. So looking at high triglycerides are very problematic. So if you have your triglycerides and you have your HDL, which is, people like to call it the good type of cholesterol, but the HDL cholesterol, take your triglycerides, divide by your HDL, that ratio should be less than 1.5. So, come back to this podcast, go find your cholesterol panel, see where you're at. I want to see your triglycerides, like I said, less than 90 is optimal in my eyes, but then you can also look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio. That will give you another reflection of where you're at with metabolic health. So again, the triglyceride to HDL ratio should be 1.5. The higher that number is, the more reflective of likely metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance you have going on, because you just have too much fat floating around in your bloodstream. And very likely the sugar, carbohydrates, ultra processed food being converted to fat by the liver. Again, this is why we get fatty liver. It's not because we're eating too much fat, it's because we're having too much sugar and carbohydrates. So those labs, so all the blood sugar, the insulin, the fasting insulin, the my goodness. Oh, Shanna should just stop at this point. But my goodness, the I cannot think of the 3-month average. I talked about it earlier, but anyway, um, I will think about it in just a second. It'll pop into my head. The HSCRP for inflammation, your cholesterol panel. Those are all hemoglobin A1C. My goodness, I could not think of that test. All of those are good lab values for you to track over time. So as your labs improve, your physical symptoms should improve. Okay. Blood pressure is another thing to look at. I didn't talk about body composition. I talked about weight. Weight is not everything. We should be looking at body composition too. So you can get a good body composition scale off of Amazon for $60, $70. You don't have to make this huge investment. I have a scale on my website that I use. Tanita makes some, Amran makes some. There's all kinds of body composition scales. And even if they're not perfect, you can at least, as long as you're hydrated, you can see what kind of progress you're making. So that way we're not so fixated on weight. And, weight is a very touchy subject, obviously. I don't recommend everybody weigh themselves every single day. But typically, as your metabolic health improves, as your labs improve, as you get your body healthy, you get your hormones balanced, your weight issues just resolve themselves. So this is why we focus on metabolic health and we focus on getting our blood sugars balanced, because then our hormones balance, we feel better, we just lose weight naturally. So that is how you can figure out the severity of your insulin resistance through symptoms, through labs. You can kind of combine all of that, go with how you're feeling, sleeping, how stress resilient, all of those things are reflections of metabolic health as well. So I hope that this episode helped you. Again, if you know you are insulin resistant, you have these lab tests, you stopped the episode and you said, oh my gosh, I'm way out there as far as, my ratios are, or everything's off, like get inside Low Insulin Academy. I won't be opening it again until 2024. So if you want to do the live version, there's 2 versions of Low Insulin Academy. One's on demand where you get all of the lessons that you can go through at your own pace. If you're a self-paced, you'd like to learn on your own, great. Do the on-demand version of Low Insulin Academy. If you like hands-on learning with a teacher, I do group coaching with you for 8 weeks. One module comes out a week. There are 6 modules in Low Insulin Academy. We do you watch the lessons on your own, and then we do the group coaching every week. It's more of a classroom style. If that is what you like and that's what you prefer, some extra support and accountability, get yourself inside Low Insulin Academy. And I will see you there. Enrollment's only open until September 14th. I hope you learned a lot in this episode. I'll see you back next week for another one.